I'm on fire today.
We are ready.
This is like our first episode without a guest,
It's true.
which is gonna like
It's
really dumb down the quality. Ones with guests like get all the hits, and then the ones with me and you are like,
a drastic dip in audience.
it's only for our core, like our hardcore
Yeah,
true fans, Clint.
yeah, it's true. It's just Clint. My folks visited for the first time to our house. Like it's much more complicated because it's not like wheelchair accessible at all. So like trying to figure out how to get my dad into the house because he's not very mobile at all. So he can do steps with a lot of assistance. Like he just turned 80. So he is an old man.
Oh,
And so he has the mobility issues because of the stroke. So it was like just maneuvering him up a couple stairs where it's like, okay, if you fall, there's definitely going to be an injury because it's all just like stone. So
mm.
it was like very nerve-wracking, but we did it. So they got to actually see the house for the first time and putz around. So that was nice. It was a good weekend.
And meet the puppy.
Yeah, they met the puppy and they haven't seen any of our new cats, so they got to meet the cats and of course see the kids. But not as important as the puppy. The puppy was the
Yeah.
star.
You know what I noticed today when I
Mm.
was checking out my socials?
Yeah.
Today is the 2-year anniversary of our very first episode. So
What, serious?
2 years
Oh,
ago
wow.
today, yeah, we launched the first episode.
Oh,
So
that's awesome.
yeah, I was gonna share it too, but I was like, there's like this new thing now. I don't know what it is, but like I feel like every
Mhm.
time I post something, like it's not getting any interaction. And like I refuse to believe that it's because I'm not cool or anything. But like everybody's been complaining about it. You're not on Facebook anymore, but everybody's been
Yeah.
complaining about it. And if you post like a selfie or it'll trick
Mhm.
the algorithms. So, but I was like,
Yeah.
what if I just start doing like really weird pictures? Like I just this weekend like sent you a picture of my head in a jar. Like they'd be like, wow, like this is my new poem. And to just, get those algae spinning, here's a picture of my head in a jar.
Oh, it's perfect for spooky season. It was so funny. I showed everyone.
I was looking for ideas because Coralie, she's a
Mhm.
Halloween baby and we're throwing her a party this
Yay.
weekend. And
Mhm.
so we're having like a big Halloween bash. And so I was looking for like cool
Yeah.
ideas and I saw like a site that you could like send your picture to
Mhm.
and they'll send your head back in a jar. And I was like, I can do this. So it's pretty easy. You just print out a picture and laminate it. Little food coloring.
Do you have your Halloween costumes? Is everyone set?
Uh, yeah, the girls are set, and Maeve's being Winnie from Hocus Pocus. Coralie's being some weird pumpkin witch thing. That's just one of her weird creations. Henry's being a foot, just a foot,
Just a foot.
just a foot. We have this whole witch theme going on in the house right now.
Mhm.
So the heads in the jar, like we converted our little workout room downstairs to like this
Yeah.
witch den. And
Ooh.
yeah, so it's like this big spooky wookie thing that we're doing for like the kids that come over and everything. So I feel like
Yeah.
even though I've been a witch like all like many years in a row, but it might work
Yeah.
this year just to be on themes.
It's good. It's a tried and true classic.
It is. So what about you guys though? What's your plan?
Um, I know Sophie is gonna be a Harley Quinn, which is this is like her fourth year doing it or her third year or something like that, but she's gonna like do a little variation, so it's at least a little bit different. I have no idea what Theo's gonna be. He hasn't said anything, so it might be some kind of weird last minute thing.
Hmm.
And Lydia and I have no idea. I kind of want to be what is it? Is it Max from Where the Wild Things Are? Is that the main little kid? I
Oh,
want like the giant onesie and a crown.
I was really excited to try and pick out a spooky poem for today.
Ooh. So let's kick this off. So welcome everybody to Table for Deuce, where we shoot the shit about all things lit. And our newly expanded website and journal is going strong. We are still pumping through submissions. We are still receiving submissions. We have new poems scheduled out. We have our single poem reviews coming up that we do every now and then. Like we have a nice little routine going. So if you have the time, definitely listen to the podcast. Go check out our website at, tableforDeuce.com. Like we have so many things going on and it's been running oddly smooth. I'm like
Yeah.
always like, when's the other shoe gonna drop? But it's been going really well. The rhythm feels right, the pacing feels right. Like I've been just having a blast, like looking at submissions and thinking about the poems that we've published. And
We made a
so
pact. We made a pact from the very beginning that like we do this as long as it's fun. And it's like still so fun.
exactly, yeah. If it becomes just work, I refuse. Like, even if it's not like a huge audience, like the fact that we're just having fun and this is getting me much more engaged with poetry and like thinking about poetry and reviews than I have been in the past like 4 years. So it's been a very engaging thing. It's been great. So, and a lot of that is due to my co-host, co-founder, writer, editor, Kate Hanson Foster, the author of Midriff and most currently Crow Funeral. And also, many of you probably don't know this. Kate is actually a very active person when it comes to social movement. She is very involved in activism, and most recently, she has been seen protesting the Nobel Peace Prize. She actually doesn't believe in peace, and she is a firm believer in just anger and rage and constant disagreements. So please welcome advocate for debates, for tension, Kate Hanson Foster.
Well, I'm here with Michael Schmeltzer, co-founder of Table for Deuce and editor of The Seat. Michael is the author of multiple prize-winning slash prize-nominated collections of poetry. He's the editor-in-chief of Floating Bridge Press. And not all people know this, but we talked about this because now that we've done so many shows, like you love Halloween, and I don't think that our listeners or viewers know how much you love Halloween, almost as much as you love poetry. So, anyways, Michael has a little routine that he does on Halloween where he goes verse or treating to the houses in his neighborhood. He brings his tote bag of verse with copies of his book, and when they open the door, he just drops those books right into the candy bin, just trying to give them a little taste of his genius.
It, it's such a fair trade. I take their candy and they get my poetry. This is the only way to get your stuff out there.
Yeah.
Not by publishing good poems consistently, but by throwing your work in people's faces constantly.
Well,
Cheers to that. I can actually kind of see that happening. Like, not with me,
I
but
can see it happening with other poets, like
I can see people dropping poems into little Halloween bins. I definitely see
opportunities
this.
everywhere when you're
Yeah.
hustling them poems.
When you're
Just gotta
hustling,
figure out a
yeah.
way.
Goodness, yeah. I wish I'm like going to sales. Y'all would be rich. You just have no
Right.
shame. You just
Right?
you just go sell a car.
Should we just go right into it?
Let's go right into it. Let's keep this neat and tidy and go right into the toaster roast.
So I picked a poem called Calling the Dead by Jennifer Wong. It was originally published from RIchie Press in 2020. On certain nights, they come back. Ghost story fragments lodged in my head from midnight taxi rides. Almost always a woman in a red dress, hollow laughter, and a ball bouncing in a playground. Lost souls crossing the misty river where Meng offers them soup to forget before their next life. And those afternoons, when my mind would spin with ominous tales, each school in Hong Kong a graveyard, we begged for our turn to go to the loo together, believed ghostly hands would sprout from faucets to bring us back to a wartime colony where Japanese soldiers raced with each other to slash more heads. The girl from my class kept a scrapbook of ghost stories. I learned that vampires in Qing Dynasty robes don't hop sideways. Some actors never came back from film shoots. And careless children disappear with each UFO. We huddled around a quivering soy sauce dish to see it moving through the Ouija board. It's be hard to make dish spirits leave. And other myths of the land of the missing. My first friend in high school, our birthdays a day apart, used to show me her palm lines, one shorter than the rest. What do you think of the place where you are now? Will we be friends in our next lives? Calling the Dead by poet Jennifer Wong. So I'll start, I guess, since this was one I picked. But I will admit that when I picked it and I threw it out to you, I skimmed it. I hadn't really given it a close read, which I want to set like as a reminder, I guess, that the poems that we choose like are not always these like banger poems that we just love and we want to promote. Like we really do try to kind of pick at random. Picking a poem that I, never really heard of or read and going at it, I like that. So anyways, but I just want to start by saying like I love the folklore and the myth references in this poem. I like folklore because I feel like it's always shaped by like our political, social, and cultural selves, and it just kind of stays with us and it passes from generation to generation. But it's also universal, even though it, like for instance, there was references in here, obviously Chinese folklore and myth references that I did not know. And researching them and reading about them, there's so much overlap, I think, in folklore from culture to culture. Like for this, the hopping Chinese vampires, it's like, it was such a unique thing, and I looked it up, and we can get into all that, but it's just a kind of another version of a ghost zombie, vampire thing like that. There's just something that's familiar. The other thing too, and this is like just like an aside, it got me thinking about do you remember that book series? It was like in the 80s and like early 90s called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it was like
Yep.
a 3 volume series, and it was just full of like these short stories about like lore and murder and myths. And I reordered all of those books because it just reminded me of it. And like I loved the nostalgia in this poem because even though it's not like someone telling or writing about being haunted continually by all these things, but almost kind of nostalgic looking back. And it made me feel that about those books. So I was like, I gotta order them. They're on their way. When they get here, I'm gonna like sit down and read it to my kids because I devoured them and I want to know if it still like hits.
Yeah, and they have like weird art in those books too,
Yes,
which is great.
the
It
covers.
is yeah, they're so bizarre and spooky. I love what you're saying about the folklore, like, and it's funny that you mentioned the kind of the nostalgia piece because when I was reading this, it's kind of fun to think of this in conjunction with French novel by Richie Hoffman because it's like kind of two different takes on like memory and things like that. So I kept paralleling them a lot in my mind in these certain instances where you have like in the first stanza of this poem, almost always a woman in a red dress, hollow laughter, and a ball bouncing in a playground. Like these little snippets that aren't too specific. They're vague enough, but I can definitely picture them. And there does seem to be almost this kind of universality or kind of collective unconscious kind of feeling about some of these images. So I had looked up a little bit on Meng offers them soup to forget, and they talk about Meng being the goddess of oblivion and creating this soup. The story goes like initially there was this a woman who lost her husband, so she kept grieving, and she had created this soup to help other souls forget their lives so that they can kind of move on to the next life and things like that. So I mean, there are all these little details within the poem that I think both are very specific to a certain culture, but also, like you said, there is that kind of universality. There's that idea of grief or the next life or mortality and losing someone. And I just really like that little detail there. And like, and also like Goddess of Oblivion is just like the most goth name I could come up with. It's such a great title. I'm like, that is so badass. But yeah, I love that first stanza and some of the details there. I really enjoyed. I thought it was like you said, just kind of takes me to a certain kind of time, and I love those kind of little spooky ghost stories. We were gonna mention the hopping vampire things because there's a version of that in Japan too. They're kyonshi, and they do the same thing, and I'm sure it's taken from the Chinese culture. But like I said, it I remember watching those movies and shows about that as a kid. There's like ghost stories that they used to have in summertime. They'd have a show all about like modern ghosts and these hauntings, and it's supposed to like make you chilly in the summertime. Like that was the whole point of this show in Japan. So it's like I just really does take me back to a certain kind of like feeling of actually being scared, which I think is a very childhood thing. Like my mom had said it once, like when you become you're an adult when like not many things scare you like they used to.
Mm.
And like my fears now aren't so much like ghosts. It's always like, oh no, what's going to happen to the kids or things like that. Like very, very real and more boring, frightening things compared to like, I would rather be scared of ghosts and hauntings and monsters than like, oh, are my kids coming home from school or is like they're going to be some kind of incident or whatnot. You know what I mean? So it's like feeling scared of these things feels so much better than feeling scared of the real world now.
It's innocence,
So
it's like
yeah.
it's the thrill of all these things. I mean,
Mhm.
I totally agree with you. And even though like some of these stories, like, yeah, they might, and this is why I want to know if the scary stories to tell in the dark hold up, right? Because now like I'm gonna reread them, and I'm gonna sit down with the kids and be like, sit down, like here comes the 80s, which my kids like to call like back in the 1900s when I was born. So I do love the innocence of it and kind of like reflecting back on, just how much we could just be thrilled,
Mhm.
by like very little things and weird stories. I do love those references, and I did have to look it up too, like the Meng
Mhm.
reference, and I thought it was so cool. And I didn't pick up on this the first read, and I don't even know if it's intentional, but like you said, the goddess of oblivion who wipes out your memories after you die. But the scary part about that is that it's wiping away everything, so it's like wiping away your bad memories but also your good memories, so that you don't even remember who you were. There was two things I picked up with that reference. One was the connection to these uh Chinese hopping vampires, because that's kind of, in reading about that folklore and those stories, there's, I guess, these customs that, that if someone did not receive a proper burial, that their soul can like awaken within their corpse. They're driven by something like that's animating their corpse, but they don't do it with like cognizance of who they
Mhm.
are. And so there's kind of that connection, I think, between this, if someone died and didn't get a proper burial, and the goddess of Ming and all that, and then you have these sort of empty-headed uh popping vampires and stuff. I thought that was interesting. And then it kind of ties itself into a bow where there's this reference at the end of this friend lost, and we don't know what happened. But my sense was, perhaps if this was a friend that disappeared, that it kind of invokes those old childhood fears of like, okay, did this friend not get a proper burial? Did this friend not get
Mhm.
put to rest properly? And there's this fear of like, will you remember me? Will we be
Mhm.
friends in our next life? And so to me, like I said, didn't happen the first time around. But once I started looking up these references and really thinking about them, I thought, okay, this isn't just an itemized list of our childhood folklore to just kind of talk about it. I think there's just something in it that still haunts us. And these random times you kind of get this old stirring inside of you where you think back to the past and you kind of, you know, think about it through an adult lens. And maybe it isn't always like, well, I've grown up now and, I know that's all foolish. Like that sometimes you kind of revert back to those old fears and concerns and questions. And I thought that was super interesting. I don't know if you had the same kind of read of it.
I hadn't actually thought about that until you were talking about it. So that's a really interesting idea. Like I mean, I know that the first friend in high school, I mean, there was something that probably happened, or they're not friends, whether it was just something more innocent and mysterious, like a move, or whether it was something a little more sinister. It hadn't really come to mind, but it is really fascinating to think about under that lens. Um, I didn't look up the any kind of reference to palm lines. I find it interesting when they talk about the palm lines, one line shorter than the rest. Like if that has significance. I didn't really do any research into that, but I imagine it does. I mean, it's a very
Well, it's your
specific
life, like
detail, and it's a very,
there's like your lifeline,
yeah,
right? So I'm
yeah,
assuming I just kind of guessed that it was a reference to maybe,
yeah,
"Hey, look at my lifeline. It's wicked short."
yeah. See, that's kind of what I had assumed as well. So I thought that was a fascinating little detail. The one thing that I think is like really kind of dark in this poem is the reference to the wartime colony and the Japanese soldiers. Like I know there's like being Japanese, like I like I love my culture and I am like very proud of who I am. And at the same time, I'm like, yeah, Japan has not been the greatest to its neighboring countries like in the past at all. And knowing some of the history and some of the wars and some of the like brutality from the soldiers and things like that, I'm very fascinated by that particular. Those just, it's such a small little aside almost in that stanza, and yet it's probably the most horrific real thing in this whole poem. I wish there was just a little more like breathing space and like exploration of that, but I'm not sure if that would have made it too grim and a little bit too much of a kind of a like divergent path that the author would have taken or whatnot. But yeah, it is such a like horrifying idea, and it's so sad to think about when these things were kind of these fears get passed down. I'm not exactly sure how old the author is, but these kind of stories and these kind of ideas about who the other is kind of gets passed down and becomes its own myth and becomes its own fears, and it is a horrifying thing to think about what different countries go through. I really thought those two lines were like, for me personally, at least, very like frightening and very powerful.
That part is heavy. And I think that,
Mhm.
when we do think of folklore and stuff, there is like a lot of these sort of charming things
Mhm.
that create these stories that happen to us in our culture. But then there's also just like, and all the references to like the Qing dynasty,
Mhm.
and learning a little bit of that history. A lot of these stories come from political violence and death and mutilation and
Yeah.
chopping heads off and things like that, and it's ugly and it's scary. There's a darkness to it. It gets repackaged into a ghost, like a ghost story, or like that, oh, these phantom fingers are going to come up, and everything. And it's just
Yep.
interesting to see that sort of, childhood innocence version of something so dark and
Mhm.
violent. The human mind just kind of does that, I think, to maybe lighten it up, maybe under like to cope or understand it. I don't know, but in to what you said about this poet's age, I don't know either, but I could only suspect that she must be around like our generation, just with these references um, and definitely the Ouija board. I mean, even though the Ouija board's still around and stuff, but like in the 80s and like early 90s and stuff, it was like that, that was like the thing to do. I ended up like watching some PBS thing. And I mean, I could probably find the link to it. It was actually just like a short online thing from PBS that they did about the Chinese hopping vampires and just and Chinese folklore and myths and things. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting was like how it's changed now in like pop culture. Like now, I guess, I mean, you see these what is the other word for it? because there was an besides I keep saying Chinese hopping vampires because that's like easy for my dumb white American mind to say. There's like another name that they're called. What did you say that the Japanese
Oh,
was?
oh, so the Japanese version of the name is Kyonshi.
Like Jianshi. So that's the Japanese word for it?
No, the Japanese one is like Kynshi.
Okay.
It's like very similar though,
Oh, okay. Well,
I
that makes more
believe.
sense. But so anyways, I started like watching this thing and it talked about like wuxia cinema. And I don't know if this is anything that like of or have watched or if you've tapped into any of the pop culture. I don't
Mhm.
really know because it's not like something that I follow, but that it brings more like comedy into it. And you sent me that clip from like
Yeah.
that movie.
Yeah.
And it's like so like I could see it would be terrifying to a kid, but like
Yeah.
watching it now, it's like they brought in like so pop culture versions of all this stuff now are like
Mhm.
super comedic too, which I thought
Yeah.
was so interesting. And I know it's kind of like an aside and not really related to the poem, but I
Mhm.
found it fascinating just how like these these different stories and myths kind of like evolve subtly and change. And another thing that I read that I thought was kind of funny based on like a truth, which is that that referenced like the hopping vampires, like I learned they move forward, like they hop or they don't hop to the side.
Yeah.
And this video was talking about that when so if like people were off like when as time went on and people were working, let's say like in more urban areas, and if say they died and they need to be brought back for like their proper burial, that they called them like the corpse drivers, and they would uh carry like two bamboo sticks on their
Mhm.
shoulders. And the corpses would be like lined up, kind of like in that clip that you sent me, which I'll
Yeah.
link to. And the illusion or like this idea where they came up with these like hopping vampires was because of the terrain that they had to cross. And it was just a lot of like bumping, up and down,
Mhm.
going up like this rocky terrain to get them back to their home, for this proper burial and stuff. And so
Yeah.
it's just interesting to me, like, because that was such an obscure thing. I'm like, what the hell is a hopping vampire? But it's based on like a little bit of truth, which is so cool to
Yeah.
me.
It is fascinating. Like you said, there is that element of like kind of comedy and stuff like that. There's a lot of like almost like slapsticky type of stuff, and that feels very. I don't want to be too general, but that's seems very Asian culture to me. Like there's a lot of that in like Japanese like filmmaking and things like that, or some of the shows that I used to watch as a kid. Like it is a very slapsticky, kind of goofy
It felt
kind of
very Monty
media.
Python like esque.
It's funny they do from what they show, like you said, there's that bumping and the hopping, and it's like they move like, like chess pieces, like the rooks. You just can go up and down, left and right, can't go diagonal. One of the things I found kind of interesting too about the poem is that there are things that are, like you said, with the Ouija board and the UFO, I don't think of as kind of Asian culture things. And then you have things that are very much steeped in like Asian culture. So the kind of juxtaposition there I found very interesting, and I'm not sure where that comes from per se. I'm not sure if it's like kind of a byproduct of just being a worldly person, if it's a byproduct of like kind of like colonization stuff. I don't know, or if it's just like being kids and consuming media of different sorts. And so but yeah, it was kind of an interesting turn. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about it because I'm like, oh, I maybe it's my own bias, but I'm like, I'm much more interested in the Chinese culture stuff than I am in like, I don't care about UFOs per se. Though they
Yeah.
used to freak me out as a kid, but still.
It felt a little bit like a filler line, for
Mhm.
sure. It's like how do you sort of bottle up all these different aspects of,
Mhm.
fear and otherworldly things. It's like if you're going to talk
Mhm.
about ghosts and vampires and, then we may as well throw in some aliens. And so it's like kind of like pack it all in. the poet is definitely is working hard, I think, to kind of convey how these things come back in an adult sort of way. There is the line about from the Ouija board.
Mhm.
And I'm just gonna go ahead and assume that it's like the way that, when you do the Ouija board and you're transcribing what,
Mhm.
you know, uh what the messages are.
Mhm.
I'm assuming that that line, like it's be hard to make dish spirits leave, is kind of conveying that sort of rough transcription from the activity of doing the Ouija board. But I wasn't exactly sure like what that meant. I didn't get that reference if it was one. About yeah, no, it's just a soy sauce. And trust me, I have made Ouija boards on pizza boxes. Like I know what it's like to do like makeshift sketchy shit. So
Yeah.
the idea of using a soy sauce dish as like the pendulum or whatever,
Mhm.
was like I'm like, yeah, I get it. But I didn't get what dish spirits and what that meant, and if it meant something significant or if it was just kind of like a reflecting back on that kind of, like I said, choppy, rough transcriptions of letters and stuff. As the poem's kind of progressing, that one particular line hung me up a little, for sure. Um, and especially because it immediately shifts to myths about the land of the missing and, missing children, the missing friend and stuff. So it's, um, but it's kind of nitpicky, I guess, but I guess it was just to piggyback on some of the stuff that you felt like, yeah, like the UFO. It felt like I need to pack in more. Like I needs to be like
Yeah.
all the things.
So there's a interesting uh what was it, like a lecture or a lesson from the creators of South Park, of all people, Matt Stone and Trey Parker. They had done this little lecture about kind of story points and how to make a story progress and things like that. And they said if you have these moments and you can connect them with and then your story's fucked. They're like, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. They're like, but if you can connect it with this happened, but then this happened, and therefore this happened. Like if you create these causations, then you have a better flowing kind of story.
Mm.
And I've been kind of looking at poems through that lens. Like, can I just end then each of these moments in this poem, or can I? Is it creating some kind of consequence? Is there a therefore this happened or a but this happened? And for me, a little bit with this poem kind of feels like a and then there are like a lot of these little details that kind of come in, and I'm not exactly sure how they are connecting or what the implications of their connections are. I know there can be like really, really interesting and really well done associative leaps and kind of lyric leaps from one thing to another, and then your brain kind of forms these really interesting connections. But I'm not exactly sure if there's enough connective tissue there for me in this particular poem. So I've been looking at it through that lens, and it's such an interesting tool to use. And I never thought it would come from the creators of South Park, but here we are. So
I agree with you to a point,
mhm.
and like I said earlier, this may be my own mental leaps that I've been doing when I just in the because I mean this is like one of my favorite things when we pick a poem and it's full of references that I don't get,
Mhm.
and so I really like to read about them and think about them. Remember that poem, I think it was Paige Lewis,
Mhm.
about like circumcision and like all these different traditions around
Yeah,
circumcision. And I like my search history was like so weird
yeah,
that
we're on a
day.
watch list right now. That's from that search list.
Framed foreskin on the wall. What? So I
Mhm.
really this is something one of the things I enjoyed the most about poetry is when there is a poem that I learned something from. And so when
Mhm.
I read about the Chinchi, did I get that right? I don't want to say Chinese hopping
Uh,
Chinese hopping
oh,
vampire again. The Jiangshi,
yeah.
um, and their and how their minds are completely wiped out. Like they're
Mhm.
just basically an empty vessel.
Mhm.
And this sort of fear and superstition around some of these things that we might outgrow the fears
Mhm.
that we had as kids, but the superstition kind of can stay. And so this kind of connection between this, mythical goddess of oblivion, which sets up the whole thing. The goal is to erase all of your bad memories, but the end result is everything is erased. It's scary to think that like there's this kind of, that you get wiped clean and that you're nothing but an animated vessel. So that brought me to, the Chinese hopping vampires. So I made like that connection, being like, okay, like this idea that maybe like these vampires are like victims of the goddess of oblivion, and then to go back and to finally feel this kind of sadness about this lost friend. And the title of like calling the dead, like it's kind of like that this is a poem, I think, calling her friend and going through these different references and kind of making these connections and maybe ultimately still having this fear of like, okay, if I lost you and I didn't go to your funeral, I don't know how you die, I don't know where you're buried. Will you still remember me? Will we be friends in our next life? That gave me chills. And or what do you think of the place where you are now and will we be friends in our next lives? I felt a little chill there and definitely like a pang of sadness. And so
Mhm.
I guess ultimately that's a long way of saying I disagree with the way you're saying. I don't think it was like and then this and then that and then this. I think
Mhm.
that the intention is there. I think making connections to these references and how it shapes us even as adults and how we view life and death and how we cope and
Mhm.
maybe deal with certain kind of losses, and that we still have these sort of weird superstitious instincts.
One thing I do find super fascinating, and it's always a really interesting, is like how cultures tackle mortality and death. And like to put it very, very generically and broadly, it's like Western culture has a very kind of linear thinking, life, death, and then maybe afterlife or nothing. And Eastern culture tends to be very circular and like reincarnation or the next life or things like that. There's this kind of cycle. And how the poem kind of doesn't like overtly say that per se. I mean, there's before the next life or in the last line, it says in our next lives. There's definitely mentions of it, but it's the idea that there is some kind of afterlife, that there are ghosts, that there are these hopping vampires, that there are a Ouija board that might be communicating like different spirits and that are animating the world that we see and don't see. And I just really like these kind of philosophical, theological questions of what that means and these like these big existential questions and how do we deal with it and what does that look like in folklore and our culture and things like that. So I do love that kind of what that brings to my mind, what that means to our current experiences. Like you said, the like forgetting everything can be a balm for some things. There are horrible experiences everyone goes through that we'd love to forget. And then there are these like really joyous moments that like define who we are and we would like be just miserable to forget them. And it's like these kind of that interplay is just a really like for me at least a fun place to be intellectually. Part of me there's I kind of flip back and forth like do I kind of like the references to Ouija board and UFO or do I not, and do I want it to kind of strictly stay in the more folklore cultural moments. And I don't know, I kind of sometimes land on the side of I kind of like them both. I kind of like these two takes on like myth or culture, like folkloric things, and then sometimes I'm like I don't know.
If you're ready, I'm ready to cast my vote about it.
I think I'm ready.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go first then because I picked the poem. And based on, I like what you're saying. The sort of the Eastern versus Western line of thinking and circular versus linear and everything like that. And I think that that is so true and poignant. Ultimately, I feel, if we want to keep harping on the UFO reference or Ouija board, and maybe, it's possible to me, because I personally I feel like folklore is the bedrock of society. Like it's, it really, there's so much of the human experience that goes into like these folklore, these stories. And even though there are so many, like in this poem, these cultural references that are very distinct, and very centered on Chinese folklore. The Ouija board and UFOs, you're right. I mean, that's more global. And I think it might speak to how folklore is, like in the sense that it is so universal, that we are always going to have these kind of cultural overlaps. And I think that's beautiful in a weird way, that there are a lot of things like that separate us, even, religiously or culturally. But then there are these other things that link us together, and these sort of overlaps. To what you said about like, does anyone else think about this stuff? Like, yes, I think that people do. I think that part of life is sort of navigating the in between. We're in between two worlds all the time, and thinking about how, the concrete and the day to day and the facts and the science mingle with these other, things that like childhood and innocence and myths and stories and gods and, all this kind of stuff. So I think we're always in that middle space. I loved this poem. I'm going to toast it. I love when I learn stuff. I wasn't expecting to toast this poem because I went into it with the expectation that it would be really, really hard to talk about these what could sometimes come off as like hokey subjects. And especially even like the very beginning when I first read it and you sent me the video of like that movie.
It's so
What's the
good.
movie called?
Oh, I don't even know.
Oh, okay.
I
I'll find
forget.
it and I'll make sure that we reference it.
Yeah.
But watching it, I was like, what? Like this poem is referencing this. It's like so. It was like I said, it felt very Monty Python. It's very challenging to tackle some of these things that could come off as kind of hokey and not deep, and probably not something that you could successfully create that sort of poetic impact. But I felt the pain. I felt the sadness of those last two lines and how it kind of all came back. It started with the myth of the goddess of oblivion and ended with the fear of, will my friend, will we ever be friends again, in our next lives? And, and do you have a memory? Have you been wiped clean? That kind of thing. And that was so powerful to me, and very impactful. So I definitely toast.
I the thing that you had focused on like this, that we didn't necessarily get into too much, but I do love poems that tackle friendships. I think like losing a friend or like just the joy of good friendships, I don't feel like get as much play as they should. I know a couple of poets who do it really well. The poet Ali Ong really does friendship poems really well. They have a book forthcoming um, soon, I think, maybe sometime early in the next year. But they have really good poems on friendships, beautiful poems, and I I do think this is one of those kind of in that tradition of like thinking about friendship, and I do think that is a beautiful thing. I do like the last stanza quite a bit, and I do love the last line quite a bit. We'll be friends in our next lives. I think that is very good. And if you haven't seen the movie Past Lives that came out, which also kind of deals with this idea of like what are we in the next life, I think it's such a beautiful concept and beautiful idea. For me, this is almost quite there. Like I like it more after our discussion. It didn't quite land with me when I first read it. I like it more now, but there's still a part of me that wants a little bit more from each thing and a little bit more connective tissue. Like I think some of the things that could be just a touch more impactful, like just don't quite land for me. And I'm missing a piece and I can't quite figure out what it is. I'm not sure if it's because I don't know the narrator as well, or there isn't enough to give me a clear grasp of the narrator, or the idea. And I'm trying to think back to Richie Hoffman's poem because I'm like, okay, why was I forgiving some of the things in that poem?
Mhm.
Like, what was it? And I'm not sure if I have to specifically look at like some of the language. Is it some of the language that I was like that created a certain kind of moment for me? But there are many moments in this poem that I like. And for me, they're just not quite cohesive in a way that I really need, sadly. So I am gonna roast this one. I'm going on the roast. Like
Oh
I just
no.
I can't, like there's something that I can't quite access, and I'm not sure if it's a matter of some of the language in it. And I'm trying to look at what keeps me from fully going into it. I think some of the word choices I just think don't quite hit for me, and I don't. And I mean, they're decent words. I don't know, like sprout from faucets. I don't know why I have a hang up with that, but it just sprout doesn't seem like a great word for me. The part about the Japanese soldiers, like I said, I wish there was just a little more, even though it's so grim, and I understand if they're kind of making things a little more like not light, but a little more a much more not sanitized version either, maybe, but like in the same way that you can create genuine fears or base things on genuine fears, but make them safe. I mean, like going to a haunted house, you have the scary experience, or going to horror movies, you have a scary experience, but deep down, you know, it's still safe. And I feel like some of these, that part about the Japanese soldier kind of does that for me, where it's like there's a genuine fear and a genuine horrific thing that happened historically that you can also kind of compartmentalize into the safe area. And I'm not sure I wanted that to be a safe thing. I need to know a little bit more what's at stake in the poem, and I'm not quite getting that.
I understand what you're saying, and we've done this before, I think, where we've both kind of, I mean, we're obviously inserting our bias into
Yeah.
our
Yep.
read. Whereas I roasted that Richie Hoffman poem. I felt like
Yeah.
there wasn't enough, and
Hmm.
and there was, and not to bring back Paige Lewis and that poem, but
Hmm.
that was another poem where I ultimately I came down to, well, if a poem is making you do too much work, um,
Hmm.
like where do you draw the line? And so this one was hard for me because yeah, like I said, I had to Google. I watched videos
Hmm.
online. I got like really into these references, but in an excited way, and learning about them, I definitely put that into my read. That's a pretty important question to ask, I guess. Um, Whether or not, in order for me to toast to this poem, I had to look those references up. And that I will say is true. I don't think I would have understood it. I definitely like the Qing Dynasty robes don't hop sideways. First read, I was like, what? Like what? It doesn't particularly sing as a line. Sometimes there's,
Yeah.
you may not understand it, but the line is so beautiful, and so it still kind of
Hmm.
works. But no, it was full of references I had to learn, I think, in order to appreciate the poem. So I don't think you are wrong
Hmm.
in your assessment of it. I just think that maybe this hit me in the right time, the right place. And once I packaged it all together between what I went and learned about and then read through it
Hmm.
again, and like I said, making those weird connections, which could just be me, because this could also be one of those things where the poet's like, I never even meant to do that, but now that you mentioned it, I'm a genius. Because that happens that happens to me all the
That's
time.
the
Like would be
that's
like,
the best moment.
I love how you made this
Yep.
connection, and I'm like, I
Yeah.
know. I thought really hard
Uh,
about that. Like that was definitely an intention.
a
So
smart reader is like the best gift
yes,
a poet can ask for.
I'm just kind of validating, I guess, your feeling, especially when you get so heavy, like into the wartime colony, Japanese soldiers and slashing off heads and things like that. I don't know. I think ultimately my opinion still stands.
Yeah.
I liked it.
So I've been thinking about that Richie Hoffman poem, and I'm like, okay, why that one? Why that one and not this one? And I kind of figured it out a little bit, at least partially, is with the Richie Hoffman poem, it's very much from the I perspective. He's like at the end of the poem, it's very much like kind of talking to this second of many, right? And I feel like with this poem, it kind of shifts into the friend's perspective,
Hmm.
I think, and it kind of misses for me, or at least I think that's the friend's perspective. The last two lines, the italics lines, I felt like were kind of like the dialogue of the friend.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure if you read it that way. So that kind of shifted for me, and maybe that's a misreading on my part, but I would have loved to know just a tiny bit more. Either it's going to stick to the one perspective and not shift at the end, or if I did misread it, then that's on me, and then I'll have to re-examine.
The Richie Hoffman French novel,
Mhm,
one of the main things that we talked about with that is that the generic
mhm.
references and the lack
Yeah.
of detail was a device.
Mhm,
You know, it was
mhm,
intentional. And this poem doesn't read like that. It doesn't feel like
mhm,
it's intentionally brushing off details because, you know, to get to the point, it feels like
mhm,
I'm trying to paint this picture. I'm trying to kind of package up, you know, this sort of folklore of my childhood into a four stanza poem, and that is very challenging. It would be lacking if it didn't have some of these references, even
yeah.
though it didn't expand, you know, really heavily on them. And so for that, it's hard to say. I mean, these are two very, very different poems. I can see what you're saying in terms of like things that you can forgive and things that they just don't work. But that's the beauty of it.
That is wonderful and fun. And I just like I get a little gleeful when we disagree because it's always just really interesting. It's always fascinating to me. I love hearing about what makes other people tick and what makes other things work for someone and not work for someone. That's the whole point. I always come away, if there's a poem that I roast that you toast, I always come away with a greater appreciation of that poem, regardless of where I fall.
Yeah,
So it's like I definitely like this poem a lot more than I did upon the first couple of readings I did, just with my own head. When I get to borrow your brain and look at it, like it's
you don't
so
want
fun.
that. You don't want that. After our 3 day, where, you know, 3 day space afterwards, after the show, where I ignore you until I decide to forgive you, then we pick up and we do it all over again.
But yeah,
Yeah.
if you out there listening or watching enjoyed the poem or didn't enjoy the poem, definitely send us your thoughts at table4deuce@gmail.com. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you have a poem that you'd like us to look at potentially for the show. We'd love to get some suggestions too. It's always fun to have poems come in from left field and ones
Yeah,
that neither of us pick so that we both can be absolutely surprised.
totally.
Um, but yeah, otherwise, like, share, subscribe, donate, send us books, do whatever, send us poems for the seat so that
Send
we
us
can
money.
potentially send us loads of money, like Elon Musk giving away 1 million at the stupid Trump rallies or whatever he's doing. God, I hate that man.
Yeah. No, and definitely check out our linked tree, the newest addition to to our
Ooh,
social
yeah.
media and
That's right.
the sense of, you know, all the different socials that we're on.
We are,
It
yeah,
surprised you.
exactly. I have it in our bio, our Instagram bio, conveniently listed out, so you can see what we're up to and where we are. So give us a visit. Let us
Yeah,
know.
around.
Until next time, then,
Till next
everybody.
time, and happy
Bye.
Halloween. I told you my bio for you today was stupid. I thought this was a toast for you. I thought it was going to be. I don't know, you think you know somebody, and then they get really mad at a UFO reference in a poem
If
and
you just get stuck on one
start
thing.
over. We gotta start over.